The rook is a chess piece worth 4.5 pawns, which moves like this. It is one of the strongest pieces in chess. So in today's video, we will be looking at the disadvantages and advantages of a rook as a piece, followed by the conditions in which the rook is the strongest, and from those findings we can then conclude 6 important principles that you must know to use the rook more effectively. Let's begin. Firstly, we shall look at the basic advantages and disadvantages of the rook. In the advantages, we have the rook is a long range piece, which means it can attack from afar. That is pretty obvious since it moves in straight lines as we had seen earlier, so it can influence matters from quite a distance. And due to this property, the second advantage is that it controls both colors. So a rook can move to both color squares, unlike the bishop, which is also a long range piece but is restricted to the color it started on. Since the rook moves in files and ranks, it is very effective at cutting off. So for example, you can see here, the rook successfully cuts off the king, whereas the bishop cannot actually cut off the king, as the king can somehow manage to reach the other side of the board because it also moves diagonally, and the bishop can only control one color. So both these advantages are sort of important to each other. And finally, it can influence both sides of the board at once. Due to its long range movement, a rook can be defending here and attacking there at the same time. For the disadvantages, we have the rook is of relatively high value, so it can fall prey to tactics. Do you know why they say that you should not bring your queen out too early? It's because the queen is a very high value piece and can be harassed by the opponent pieces. Same applies to the rook, which is also classified as a major piece. It is worth 4.5 pawns, so exchanging it for a knight or a bishop is not really a favorable trade. This makes it an easy target for tactics such as pins, forks, skewers, etc. The second disadvantage is that it is quite useless in closed positions where there are lots of pawns, especially when there are no open files. As you will see, the rook is best placed on an open file. So if there are no open files, the rook will be acting like a tall pawn behind its own pawns. In the third disadvantage, we have the rook is not a good defender as it cannot control squares diagonally. Like we had seen in the bishop video, you can check that out here. The fianchetto structure is quite rigid defensive structure, but there is no such structure for the rook, because despite the rook moving on both colors and it attacking things from afar and all that, it is not very good at controlling diagonal squares because it actually cannot control diagonally. So this makes it a very useless defender when it comes to defense. Now let's look at the conditions which favor the rook. So as we had discussed earlier, it is best placed on open files from where it can actually do something. Then it is also better when action is on both sides of the board, as we had seen. Now here's a new one. It is useful on the 2nd or 7th rank if you're white, as it can cut off the enemy king and attack the enemy pawns. Since the starting rank for the pawn is the 2nd or the 7th rank, the rook on the 7th, as they say, is really strong because it not only cuts off the enemy king, it also attacks a lot of pawns. So it can become quite the devastating force to reckon with. So now, based on our newfound knowledge, we can now condense these facts into 6 major, important, yet simple practical positional principles, followed by some instructive examples to help you use your rook properly. So the first principle is quite obvious. Try to keep your rook on open or semi-open files. Black's rooks are completely passive behind their own pawns, while white's major pieces are dominating from their semi-open files. So let me just give you a brief overview of what an open file and a semi-open file is. An open file is a file which has no pawns on it, neither yours nor the enemy pawn. And a semi-open file is a file which does not have your pawn on it, but has an enemy pawn on it. So as you can see here, The A file is semi-open because there are no white pawns, but there is a black pawn, as you can see. So this is a semi-open file. The same applies to the D file, which is not having white pawn but has a black pawn. So both these files are semi-open, and as you can see from the arrow, black has just played rook d8. So both black's rooks are completely passive behind their own pawns, and white can now decide the matter with rook a6. All the pawns are under attack. Black is going to lose material and eventually will lose the game. The second principle is 2 minor pieces for a rook and a pawn is a good trade. So if you are presented with the choice, don't be afraid to give away your rook and a pawn for 2 minor pieces. And even if you do the math, 4.5 plus 1 is less than 3 plus 3. By the way, if you want to know more on why the value of the rook is 4.5 and not 5 as we commonly call it, do check out my video on the value of the pieces. So here we're gonna look at quite a common opening. e4, e5, the king's pawn opening. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian game. Bishop c5, knight c3. So white is playing the two knights. And now here black plays the standard knight f6. Now you may have never seen this move before, but knight g5 is actually quite a possible move. The reason why it isn't as effective here is because black can simply castle. If black were to play knight f6 here, then knight g5 was a different story, as black cannot castle and then would have to play d5, which would go into the mainline theory of the fried liver attack. However, after this sequence of moves, it is now not necessary to play d5, which is in fact a pawn blunder. Black can in fact castle, and if white takes knight f7, rook f7, bishop f7, king f7, you can see here from the engine evaluation that black is completely winning, because white's rooks are way more passive than black's two minor pieces, and it is in fact these two minor pieces which will eventually decide the game. Of course, a rook and a pawn is not always worse than two minor pieces. There are always exceptions, but this is the general norm. Next, a rook, or even better both the rooks on the 7th rank are very dangerous. As we had already seen, the rooks on the 7th are quite a powerful force because of their cutting off and attacking abilities. Now we will look at an instructive example to show you why exactly two rooks on the 7 should never be against you. So here, should white take g7 and go for a draw in the equal rook endgame, or can he do better? Well, based on the principle you learnt, the obvious move is rook e2 e7. So in fact this also covers principle number 4, which is keep your rooks doubled as they work more effectively together. So by combining those two principles, we have created an extremely powerful scenario where the rooks are doubled on the 7th rank. Now black can play b5, and after rook c7, king b6, rook b7, king c6, rook a7, and if black decides to take the pawn, then rook a6, king d5, and now rook e6. A lot of mating threats, that too in the endgame. So you can see how much power the two rooks on the 7th have. Number 5. Two rooks are usually better than a queen if your king is safe from checks. So obviously the queen is quite a mobile piece, so it can give checks in many various ways. So that is why if your king is safe from checks, then the two rooks will outshine the queen, as they are 2 units and the queen is 1. So if the two rooks attack a pawn, black can technically only defend it once, or he will have to include his king in the defense, which is never a good idea. So here, as you can see, white's king is pretty safe behind his wall of pawns, so white can safely play rook d to d6, attacking the h6 pawn, and black can try giving a check, but after king h2, there are no more checks in the position, and black is completely doomed. As let's say queen f1 trying to capture f2, rook h6, maybe he can play king g7, we can also play rook f6 and then go for the g4 pawn, and just to sum it up, black is doomed. The last principle is that in rook endgames, your rook is usually better placed behind your pawn or the enemy passed pawn. This is because it can monitor the motion of the pawn and sometimes even help it to promote. These scenarios also lead to various kinds of tactics, as we shall see in this example. So here, white's rook on a3 is behind his pawn on a7, while black's rook is in front of it. So this deems the black rook to passivity, because if it ever moves, then white will promote. And this is exactly why there are so many tactics, because now we can play rook into h8. Black will either have to take the rook on h8 or give up his rook on a8. So let's say he takes, and now we can simply promote. He will have to take the queen and we will be completely a piece up and therefore win the game. That is the power of keeping your rook behind yours or the enemy's passed pawn, as the same could be applicable. So for example, if this pawn were, let's say, a black passed pawn, then we wouldn't necessarily sacrifice material, but if he ever moved his rook, then his own pawn would fall. So that is why it's always useful to have a rook behind your or the enemy passed pawn. Well, that's it for today, friends. Please make sure to like and subscribe so I can keep making content like this. Till then, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.